Okay, continuing on with these, this is the last part of chapter 1. Jung's been talking a lot about nominalism and realism as the representatives of two psychological attitudes. Realism on the side of introversion and nominalism on the side of extroversion. And this last part of chapter 1, Jung focuses on ways of reconciling the two attitudes, as far as I can tell. And it's pretty interesting. He wants to say essentially that there's not an intellectual resolution to the two attitudes. That there has to be kind of a psychological, like a living reconciliation of the two attitudes. So he introduces this concept of being in the soul as opposed to being in the intellect and being in the thing itself, as a kind of resolution of the two attitudes. And this applies in Anselm's ontological argument, in that, so Kant is critiquing the ontological argument, and he finds a logical flaw with the idea that if you can think something is beyond which there's nothing greater, then it must also exist. He finds issue with that, which many modern people do. And he gives the example of that it works with $100 as well, or that there's $100 in your pocket. And so this is a kind of classic NTP universalizing of the argument, like it has to work for every specific content. And then Hegel, the highly contextual thinker, says, we are losing something here with this analogy between God and $100, which is that the concept of God obviously has a lot more psychological effect than just $100 or 100 notes or whatever. So this is the idea, is that life itself, not abstracted, not intellectualized, is the mediator between these opposing attitudes. And he introduces this kind of concept. He calls it fantasy for some reason. I don't know. That seems like a really bad term, because it kind of brings up ideas of phantasm and ghost and unreality. And he proposes that Christian culture kind of denigrates fantasy, which is a very strange idea. And then he, in the last chapter, he proposes that Christ himself has also been a resolution of introversion and extroversion in the idea of the incarnation, which is actually very interesting, because that's how Jonathan Pageau talks about Christ also. He talks about the incarnational principle, and that the West has lost the incarnational principle to a large extent, and he's referring to these splits between nominalism and realism also. So both Jung and Jonathan Pageau kind of agree that Christ is a mediator between the two attitudes. Jonathan obviously wouldn't specifically have the extroversion and introversion idea. And then he also introduces the feeling, or the four functions in this chapter. It's the first time he's mentioned the four functions together, but he's been talking about feeling, thinking, and sensation throughout. So it makes me wonder whether there was kind of widespread knowledge of these things, and that he was using it systematically, and just kind of relying on his audience to be able to figure it out. Yeah, and the last thing I guess I wanted to talk about is Jung talking about the feeling function and this idea of practical psychology, and how it's not. I mean, it kind of reflects on what I'm doing, which is purely an intellectual project. I mean, what I'm trying to do here is get things down to a pure name, like a name that has the farthest reach, and itself isn't kind of contaminated with unstable concepts. And Jung's point is that psychology is obviously, because it deals with the human, kind of inherently incomplete without a non-intellectual approach as well. And that's a fair comment, I think. And I think it shows why the feeling function has been difficult for me to pin down in a real systematic way. Yeah, because I've really been intellectualizing the feeling function. I mean, I've been both in trying to give a definition of it and also in describing its activity. Like I've been like, okay, well, how does the feeling function play in kind of these ontological determinations, and kind of one of the things I've been thinking about is like it seems to side on the side of variability more often than the thinking function, and that's true, but it also obfuscates most of what the feeling function does. As I was thinking about the differences between ENTPs and ENFPs, I was like, man, this is really hard to grasp abstractly what's going on. And then I kind of had to put it in the realm of non-purely intellectual activity to actually understand what's going on with the ENFP. I was thinking like, okay, the ENTP makes these analogies and the ENFP has this connecting idea, but it's not really making these analogies. So like, what is the nature of its, again, intellectual activity? And then I realized like, okay, if you take it out of the realm of the purely abstract and intellectual, put it into the realm of like actual physical things, you can see how the ENFP combines things in a different way, and it's clear. But I'll save that for a future video. So yeah, I mean, it's a kind of an unsatisfying end to the first chapter, but it also gives me a clearer desiderata of my aim, because I think really the resolution of the introverted and the extroverted attitude is what I'm going for here.